we're going to win 4 more years in the White House.
Think of it this way. Donald Trump is trying to do something that nobody has ever even attempted before in modern history. Run for re-election as an incumbent president who's never been above 50% job approval in the Gallup poll. Never even been attempted before.
What is this election about? Depends on who you ask.
We are in a battle for the soul of this nation.
If the left gains power, they will demolish the suburbs.
It's really about which candidate voters trust to bring the U.S. out of 3 massive moments of upheaval: a healthcare crisis, an economic collapse, and a reckoning around racial equity.
That question, what's the election about, is really the baseline question for every campaign. And we forget that at our own peril. And I think in this case, in 2020, the election is basically a referendum on Donald J. Trump.
I'm the only thing standing between the American dream and total anarchy, madness, and chaos. And that's what it is. I'm representing you. I'm just here.
To better understand how we got here, we have to rewind and go back to the start of this year.
Before the coronavirus, the equation was much simpler. It was a question of whether the economy was good enough to overcome the misgivings and the doubts and the uncertainty that people had about whether they could stand 4 more years of Donald Trump. He was conducting a different kind of presidency, but he could say, I've given you an economic result that you've got to be happy with. That was a very simple equation.
What I heard from people, even people who didn't necessarily care for the president, they would say things like, I don't love the tweets, I don't love some of the style, but everyone in my family is employed. My 401k is doing great.
The U.S. economy is now in its longest economic expansion in history.
It has been an unbelievable year for stocks.
Article 1 is adopted.
The Trump campaign came into 2020 feeling pretty confident. The Mueller report had come and gone. The president was impeached but wasn't removed from office.
The Trump campaign had momentum coming out of January. And then on the way back from his last international trip in 2020, the president learned that the situation with the coronavirus was worsening.
While Trump is on Air Force One, there's a CDC press conference about COVID. Not whether it's going to come to the country and spread, but how bad it's going to be. Trump stays up the entire time, being concerned about what is being said about COVID. He comes back, he lands in Washington, and in fact, the entire presidency, the entire race has changed.
Days later, on February 29th, South Carolina held its primary, which marked a historic moment when Democrats lined up behind Joe Biden.
I would absolutely describe South Carolina as a turning point for Joe Biden.
Congressman Clyburn, who is sort of a kingmaker in South Carolina politics, especially with African American voters, ended up endorsing Joe Biden, which kind of sealed the deal for Joe Biden.
I know Joe. We know Joe. But most importantly, Joe knows us.
There wasn't a clear front-runner at the beginning of the year on the Democratic side, but there was a sense that maybe Bernie Sanders' time had actually arrived. The party had moved to the left, progressives were ascendant. I think what changed was a sense of almost panic in the Democratic Party. We can go with our heart and pick a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren. That'll make us happy as progressives, but maybe we should go with our head and pick the guy who's going to be tougher for Donald Trump to beat.
I am ending my campaign and endorsing Joe Biden for president.
I'm delighted to endorse and support Joe Biden for president.
I've been doing this since 1980, one way or another. I've never seen a single primary change a presidential campaign the way the South Carolina primary changed the 2020 race. It did that because Joe Biden went from being foot in the grave to the dominant force in the party in one day. The party establishment all lined up behind Joe Biden.
I warned you I was coming back, and I'm back. I'm back.
Almost universally and almost immediately. And that was a huge statement, and it changed everything. His basic argument was that this is going to be a campaign and an election about the character of America, about not what my policies are, but whether I can bring people together and stop being so divisive with one another.
From the beginning of his campaign, Biden had made this theme a centerpiece of his platform.
We are in the battle for the soul of this nation.
It seemed like almost a hokey message at the beginning. It seems strangely resonant now.
More specific aspects of Biden's platform include raising the minimum wage, partial student loan forgiveness, and an emergency COVID-related paid leave plan for at-risk workers. Biden is also committed to tax policy reforms, which would raise corporate taxes and taxes on Americans making more than $400,000 a year. In the days that followed, Biden won the majority of Super Tuesday states handily and picked up more endorsements.
I am with great enthusiasm going to endorse Joe Biden for President of the United States.
Kamala Harris was expected to endorse Joe Biden, even though they had a heated back and forth last June during a debate.
Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No.
Do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education.
And when she endorsed him, it was interesting because Joe Biden had Cory Booker on one side and Kamala Harris on the other side, and said that he was going to be the candidate who would be the bridge to the next generation of Democrats.
Look, I view myself as a bridge, not as anything else. There's an entire generation of leaders you saw stand behind me. They are the future of this country.
As Joe Biden secured his nomination, President Trump delivered his first public speech about the virus.
My fellow Americans,
this was to be the president's first attempt to explain the virus to the nation and lay down some new travel restrictions.
Inside the White House, there was a lot of disagreement on whether or not to even address the nation over coronavirus. That fight happened all day, to the point where speechwriting was happening up until the last few minutes before the cameras turned on in front of Trump in the Oval Office. And the speech itself is basically a disaster.
to keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days.
His explanation of the Europe travel ban almost immediately had to be corrected by aides. People weren't clear exactly who it affected, what countries it affected, did it affect goods? And then what it set off in the subsequent days was a real panic situation at European airports as Americans were sort of fleeing to try and come home.
God bless you and God bless America. Thank you.
So by the end of this 10 minutes, there's all kinds of confusion in the White House and outside of the White House. Stock futures almost immediately drop, and the next day we see the biggest rout in stocks in 30 years.
The biggest drop we've seen since that crash in 1987.
The president's order was similar to those being used by other governments around the world to slow the spread of the virus. After reaching all-time highs in mid-February, the day after Trump's speech in March, the Dow slid around 2,300 points on rising fears of a global economic slowdown. More than a week later, the market bottomed as lawmakers remained at odds over a stimulus package. But over the next 6 months, the Dow recovered rapidly.
To understand where Trump is right now, you have to sort of consider where he was at for 2+ years leading up to this point. He wants to run on the economy.
The point at which it became clear the coronavirus was the campaign story was when President Trump decided to go out into the White House press briefing room every day at 5 o'clock or thereabouts. So that told you he realized this had become the story.
Around this time, Trump began to promote coronavirus policies contrary to those being pushed by healthcare professionals. Elected officials across the country were struggling to find a balance between protecting public health and limiting damage to the economy. On March 23rd, the president said that the economy needed to reopen soon.
We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. We're not going to let the cure be worse than the problem.
What frustrated people inside the White House was that they knew that this was a nationwide emergency and that people were tuning in to get moment-by-moment information amid a crisis. And what they were seeing in a lot of cases was Trump sparring with reporters on ancillary issues.
You're so disgraceful. It's so disgraceful the way you said it.
In early April, the CDC issued its first recommendation that Americans should wear masks in public.
This is voluntary. I don't think I'm going to be doing it.
It was a sign, a signal from the president, and he's really good at signaling people in his base out there, that he wasn't going to go along with this because masks were seen as a sign that we needed to stay hunkered down. And it was the symbolism of the masks that was really important from that point on, because people who were wearing masks were essentially saying, I think the country needs to stay hunkered down and maybe even shut down.
One of those was Joe Biden, who early on took a strong position in support of wearing masks.
When you go in public going forward, will you be wearing a mask?
Yes. Look, I think it's important to follow the science, listen to the experts, do what they tell you.
People who weren't wearing masks were saying, I'm with President Trump. We need to get out of the foxhole and start living again.
In mid-April, public anger about mask regulations and lockdown measures led to protests at the Michigan State Capitol in Lansing.
protests in Michigan really signaled the start of sort of the culture wars around the virus. And what we saw throughout the country were very different feelings on how governments should be treating this, whether or not businesses and states should be shutting down. But it also showed a real variance of opinion on whether you're trusting your elected officials, whether you're trusting the guidance of healthcare professionals.
I can't breathe.
This was a classic example where the picture is worth 1,000, 10,000, a million words.
I don't think most of us realized how it was so quickly going to snowball into these huge protests all across the country.
I would talk to a lot of white folks in Philadelphia who would say, like, 5 years ago they would have never said Black Lives Matter, and here they are with Black Lives Matter t-shirt and a poster and have their third night on the street. And then for a lot of the black folks I talked to, you know, watching that clip of Floyd was just heartbreaking, and a lot of folks had had enough, and they could think of nothing else they could do except take to the streets to voice that frustration.
In the days following George Floyd's death, President Trump tweeted a message many critics felt was highly divisive.
With the tweet, looting and shooting, the president made clear what his campaign message was going to be at a time when a lot of Democrats and Republicans were calling for a president to be less divisive and to talk about race in a more sort of healing way. He was clearly building up this message of law and order, where he was going to accuse Democrats of instigating chaos in liberal-leaning cities.
The tweet was later flagged by Twitter for violating the company's rules about glorifying violence. After the outcry, Trump said he was not aware of the phrase's origin.
People forget about this. In 2016, and much less dire circumstances, he says in his acceptance speech at the Republican convention, "I'm going to be the law and order candidate in this campaign."
An attack on law enforcement is an attack on all Americans.
After a week of unrest across the country in late May, President Trump visited St. John's Church across the street from the White House. The president's visit led to peaceful protesters being forcibly removed from the area.
A couple days before, news had broken that Trump had been taken to a safe bunker inside the White House while protests erupted around the White House complex. Trump is very concerned about the image this portrays and decides almost at the last minute to have law enforcement clear protesters from the park in front of the White House so that he and his aides can walk over to a church and he can hold up a Bible in triumph.
He wanted to show that he could come out, that he was surveying the damage, that he was strong. But he also very much wanted to signal to the Christian right, who remain a key part of his political base, that he is with them and he supports them.
Over the summer, protests swept across the country. Statues were torn down and videos of violent clashes between protesters and police were shared widely on social media. Although largely peaceful, some of these protests descended into rioting and looting. On June 7th, a Wall Street Journal NBC News poll found that 80% of the country felt that the nation was spiraling out of control.
I think that poll did capture what people were feeling.
The news is filled every day with reports about death tolls rising, cases rising. People are really, really worried.
I can think of two times when this happened during a presidential election year previously. 1968, Vietnam War, racial discord in the streets, civic unrest at the Democratic Convention, a kind of a feeling the wheels are falling off the cart. In 1980, you have stagflation, you have a feeling that the energy crisis is out of control, people are in gas lines, Iranian students take hostages at the American embassy in Tehran. Again, a feeling the wheels are coming off the cart. So how does it work this time? You would think it's not good news for the incumbent, but it's also been good news for the law and order candidate in the past.
In late June, Trump attempted to take his campaign back on the road to Tulsa.
The campaign schedules a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They're looking for a location with low cases of the virus. They think they can do it safely, and they schedule it for Juneteenth.
Which is, of course, the celebration of emancipation of slaves in America. And activists there were concerned that him being there amid all this unrest, and in Tulsa specifically, which has such a dark history.
Tulsa was the site of one of the worst race riots in U.S. history. After critics accused the president of insensitivity, The rally was rescheduled for June 20th, but on the day of the event, things didn't go as planned.
The campaign started estimating that hundreds of thousands of people were going to descend upon Tulsa for this rally. In reality, only about 6,000 people show up, and it's the first rally in 5 years that is half empty for Trump.
Until this point, both candidates had relied on virtual events to get their message out.
Joe Biden is really a retail politician. He loves to be in front of people, and he loves to get close to them and have personal conversations and give hugs, and this campaign has not played to those strengths. For a lot of the summer, Joe Biden was not terribly visible. The Trump joke was that he was hiding in his basement, but really he was doing interviews and TV appearances and Zoom appearances.
The reason I'm so optimistic is because of your generation. 600,000 brave postal workers deserve our full support.
The Biden campaign's argument was, number one, we're listening to the scientists and they say it's not safe to do these things. And number two, they felt like they just needed to stay out of Trump's way and let him make his own mess.
On August 11th, Biden announced Kamala Harris as his running mate.
Your next Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris.
This fulfilled a promise he made back in March.
I commit that I will, in fact, I'll pick a woman to be Vice President.
There was a lot of pressure on Joe Biden to pick a black woman because of the widespread support he had gained from black people during the primary, and saying that black people had saved his campaign.
She was the obvious choice, a woman of color who had done respectably well as a candidate herself and who had a significant base in California, a lot of money, support. The obvious, and in some ways the safest choice.
After being postponed for a month because of coronavirus concerns, the DNC kicked off in August, but the 4-day event was significantly downsized. Most of the speakers participated virtually or pre-taped their comments. Even the candidate didn't travel to the host city, Milwaukee, to accept his nomination.
Usually there are thousands and thousands of people packed into a stadium or an arena for a few days. We basically saw none of that this year. The message that Democrats and Joe Biden were trying to get across was that Joe Biden is portraying him as a healer, showing that he's someone who has been through grief and tragedy and can bring people together.
At the convention, the Democrats definitely want to put the focus on the pandemic and the recession. They really tried to draw a connection between the president's handling of the virus and how that relates to not only the economy, but also on how it affects their livelihood, and trying to speak to the frustrations people feel with the lockdowns.
We'll have a national mandate to wear a mask, not as a burden, but as a patriotic duty to protect one another.
A week later, Republicans presented a much different message at their convention.
Biden is a Trojan horse for socialism.
In contrast with the DNC, some RNC events were held in person, and in many cases, attendees didn't wear masks or social distance.
No one will be safe in Biden's America.
In the days that followed, Biden pushed back on Trump's accusations.
Ask yourself, do I look like a radical socialist with a soft spot for rioters? Really?
A month later, 3 themes that have dominated the campaign, the coronavirus, the economic fallout, and civil unrest, all came to a head as the 2 candidates finally met face to face. Although neither candidate wore masks, they did socially distance from one another.
On the manifesto, we call it, and that gives you socialized medicine.
Look, hey,
Are you saying
I'm not
you
going to
didn't
listen
agree?
to him. The fact of the
What Americans saw on Tuesday night was less a debate and more a verbal brawl, a kind of a verbal food fight in which there was a lot of insulting and interrupting, in which most of the rules of decorum that have marked presidential debates in the past simply went out the window.
When needed, I wear masks.
Okay, let me ask.
I don't wear masks like him. Every time you see him, he's got a mask. He could be speaking 200 feet away from it. He shows up with the biggest mask I've ever seen.
Days after the debate, on October 2nd, President Trump tweeted that he had tested positive for the virus. That evening, he headed to Walter Reed Medical Center.
I'm going to Walter Reed Hospital. I think I'm doing very well.
The president has since been released, but it remains uncertain if he will debate Joe Biden in the weeks to come.